Welcome back to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're discussing a new Real Clear Investigations report that challenges one of society's most entrenched taboos, the idea that violence in relationships is almost always men harming women. There's a federal office of violence against women, but no equivalent for men. And when women are the aggressors, they're often portrayed as acting in self-defense. But new research is complicating that picture. A Canadian study of nearly 36,000 teens found that boys reported significantly higher rates of physical violence in dating relationships than girls did over a 10-year period. While men typically inflict more severe injuries because of their physical strength, decades of studies suggest that women are nearly as likely to initiate violence. Similar studies in the UK back up the Canadian findings, yet many advocates fear that recognizing male victims could undermine decades of progress in acknowledging women's suffering. Experts say these findings expose a cultural blind spot. Young women are experiencing rising levels of anxiety and depression, and sometimes those struggles surface as aggression. Yet stereotypes persist that men lash out and women internalize. That makes male victims less likely to report abuse, and when they do, their claims are often dismissed. Academic researchers have been a part of the problem, pushing back on those willing to tackle this controversial topic. The issue gained worldwide attention during the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial in 2022, when their therapists testified that the couple engaged in mutual abuse. Domestic violence is often wrapped up in gender-focused activism that doesn't account for the equal prevalence in gay and lesbian relationships. Researchers argue it's important to move away from the battle of the sexes narrative and towards understanding the mental health challenges that drive violence, no matter the gender of those involved. We're joined now by the lead investigator on this story, psychologist Christopher J. Ferguson. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
So let's start with the taboo itself. Why is it so difficult for society to see women as capable of violence, and why do men often struggle to admit that they've been victims?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, I think that, first off, there are long-standing, stereotypes about men and women that, men are more aggressive, more assertive, and in some cases more violent, and women are more passive, less assertive, certainly less physically violent. And there's some truth to that. Of course, if you look at violent crime, men are overwhelmingly represented in violent criminal populations and such. And I think also the second thing is that, in the 1970s, when feminists were drawing attention to violence towards women and domestic violence and rape and things like that, they really focused in on that as a women's issue. So violence was something done by men to women. And I think that combination has really solidified this view in the public consciousness that domestic violence is a crime, again, by men against women. And that has made it very difficult to acknowledge that. And, in many cases, that's more complicated than that. Perhaps both people are being assaultive towards each other, or maybe it's going in the opposite direction. And I think that does make it hard for men, in some cases, to acknowledge that what's happening to them may not be good. And it's difficult for them to get help from a society or a community of health professionals who may not take their concerns very seriously.
So your reporting notes that women's rising rates of anxiety and depression may sometimes manifest in this violent behavior. And it probably goes both ways, that the same could be said for men. How does mental health complicate our understanding of domestic violence?
Sure. So the reality is that, certain types of mental health issues can escalate violence risk. And that's something, that mental health advocates have really pushed against in many cases, and for good reasons. We don't want to stigmatize people with mental illness or portray them all as if they are violent. But the reality is that different types of mental illness do increase our risk of engaging in violent criminal behavior, and that can include domestic assault. So when we look at people who are engaged in domestic violence, you tend to see that on average clustering among individuals who have more depression, who have more conditions like borderline personality disorder and other types of mental health struggles. So we kind of recognize this in ourselves. We may be more irritable the more stressed or anxious or depressed that we are. Hopefully we don't engage in assaults, of course. But for individuals who may already be struggling with more issues around aggression or anger, having that depression, having that anxiety, that stress is going to increase the likelihood of them engaging in domestic violence.
So how do we balance acknowledging that women can be perpetrators without discrediting the very real violence and the very, real things that people have been fighting to help, get resources for and help out that they still face it from men?
Yeah. Well, I think that is the very real concern that a lot of people have is if we start talking about men as victims of violence, that is somehow going to take away from women's issues. That we're going to say, well, maybe people be less sympathetic towards women because they're also violent, or it's going to take away from the resources and such. And I think we just have to get out of this sense of this being kind of a zero-sum end game that only one group can have attention or resources. I think we can take seriously the issue that oftentimes women are victims of domestic violence. And perhaps even if the perpetration of domestic violence is roughly equal, that men's upper body strength still may mean that women are more likely to be injured than men are. So we can pay attention to that issue. And at the same time, that doesn't mean we have to be exclusionary or not worry about men who may be experiencing abuse themselves, which still can be in many cases quite physically harmful, certainly emotionally harmful for them as well. So I think we just have to try to work to get out of this mentality that one sex has to win and the other sex has to lose, and that we can really just be worried about both groups of individuals who are experiencing violence.
And so what is your research and your study of this topic found?
Yeah. So what, the work that I've done in this area has been consistent with, really quite a number of studies over the past probably nearly 50 years at this point, which finds that, even though it certainly is true for most violent crimes that males are overrepresented, that specifically for the issue of domestic violence, you tend to find about equal rates of perpetration between men and women, and typically for the same motivation. So there's also not a big difference in terms of self-defense as a motivation, for instance. That most domestic violence seems to be out of frustration, anger, retaliation, issues like that. And it's a pretty consistent pool of evidence at this point that suggests that is true. And what's remarkable about that, I think, is that hasn't penetrated into the sort of public consciousness very well. That even though we do have this relatively consistent pool of research evidence, that people still generally think of domestic violence as something men only do to women. And of course, we find domestic violence in gay and lesbian relationships as well. So it's something that we're seeing across the wide spectrum of different types of relationships out there.
And so how do we find a solution for both sides without kind of causing a gender war, causing, pitting one against the other? What's a solution that would benefit both men and women who are suffering from domestic violence?
I think what makes it tricky sometimes is you see, partisans on each side really try to make it about their side. So you certainly still do see, what we might think of like a second wave feminists who really say this is about patriarchy, this is about men, engaging in violence towards women. And maybe that's not super helpful. We also find sometimes that the men's rights activists who are doing the same thing, that, this is, that women are out to get men, this is a society that is anti-male and this sort of thing. And I think we need to sort of, get towards the middle and say, like, yes, I mean, women definitely have some struggles in our society, and sometimes men have struggles in our society as well. And once again, we can find it within us to be compassionate for both men and women, particularly those who are having, who are experiencing violence, who are having other difficult times. And we don't need to make it a contest. So I think, those of us hopefully that are not on either of those sort of extremes can keep trying to get that message out there. Like, look, this is not a contest. One sex doesn't have to win. We can be concerned with the welfare of both men and women at the same time. We can have two thoughts in our head at once. It's possible.
Beyond just the messaging, do you think it needs to be more mental health resources to help, nip these things that are then, escalating to these issues in the bud? Do you think let's also create a federal office for, or at least include men in the federal offices for domestic violence? How would you find a tangible solution to the issue?
Well, I definitely think there needs to be more resources for men in this area. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges you find is that for men who are experiencing domestic violence and who do want help, for instance, that there are very few resources out there for them. And I'm not saying it has to be 50-50. I'm not saying, men need exactly the same number of resources as women. We may still think maybe 80-20, 70-30 is the correct split. We can kind of figure things out there, but 100-0 is probably not the right balance. necessarily. So, I mean, that could be, more, therapeutic services that focus in on, men's issues, again, without that being a full-blown men's rights movement, kind of a thing. That might be something like recasting, the federal offices for violence, against women as maybe, something a bit more broad. Maybe, again, most of the focus may still be on women, but there may be some, subsidiary offices for men or other individuals as well. And I think, again, it's just, more research on this area. If you look at the research that's done on domestic violence, again, overwhelmingly, most of it kind of focuses on women as victims rather than as men as victims. I think that's changing somewhat. But I do think, getting the message out there publicly is a big part of it as well, because it's been so, it kind of goes up and down, but it's been kind of tricky to get the public to care about this. I don't know, other than during like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, there are these sort of, high profile instances that sort of bring attention to this. But even with that case, I think you could see some of the pushback from some people who just refuse to believe that this could be a case of mutual abuse.
I mean, even your researchers seem to also talk about how, there was researchers have received pushback of just, conducting this data. So I do think there's a bit of a taboo surrounding it, as your article points out, that needs to hopefully be taken away so that we can move forward in a productive way. Is there anything you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it's almost, I don't want to say funny because it's a very serious issue, obviously, but it was certainly ironic that this was particularly in the 70s when a few researchers started really looking at the sort of, equality in domestic violence. And they would get, in some cases, bomb threats, when they were speaking, publicly. I think that the irony there, don't say women can be violent or we'll bomb you is a really, ironic message to send out there, somewhat. But no, I mean, I think it's just important to understand that, this does seem to be a pretty consistent pool of evidence. And, again, this doesn't mean that on average women are as violent as men. Men still engage in far more violent crimes overall, mostly against other men, is worth pointing out. And at the same time, we can recognize that in a few areas, such as domestic violence, such as violence toward children, for instance, we might also see a bit more parity, a bit more equality between men and women.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on today. It's always a pleasure.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.